Today we're going to discuss trauma and exactly what is trauma. Good morning, it's Lisa with Lisahealyourself. Disclaimer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a therapist. However, I do have a very strong opinion about trauma. Having experienced deep trauma and come out the other side of it gives me insight that is invaluable to this topic. And so I think the term trauma is first of all being used very loosely today by many people, including therapists and including online influencers. And so I want to talk about trauma. There is this idea being pushed around that there's like capital T trauma and that there is small t trauma, but that they're both trauma. And I don't think that's true. Certainly there is varying degrees of trauma. However, I do think trauma is trauma. And then we have something called hardship or adversity. Okay. And I think that gets confused or mislabeled as this small t little trauma. And I'd like to go through the difference on what I think trauma is and is not, because I think it's disingenuous to tell people that they're dealing with trauma when they're actually not. They're actually dealing with adversity or challenges. So let's first start with trauma. Trauma is something that happens to someone by someone else or through an event or an experience. Something happens to you or to a person. And this event means it is so difficult for you to handle and experience, and you aren't able to process it. It is an unprocessable event or trauma or experience or relationship or something that happened, whatever it is that happened. It is so horrible. It is so difficult that you simply can't process it. It is unprocessable to you as a human being. And because it is too difficult for you to process this trauma, it affects you on such a deep and profound level that it changes your identity and it changes your worldview so that you are never the same again. It changes fundamentally your personal identity and the world view that you have of the world, and not for the better. It changes it for the worse. It changes it so that you now do not feel safe in the world you live in. You do not feel okay or worthy or lovable or safe. Something very fundamental you no longer feel. It shifts your view of the world and yourself for the worse, because this event has been so difficult to process. It has been unprocessed by you, and it shifts the very foundation of how you view yourself and the world in a negative way. This is trauma. This is trauma. It can happen for many different reasons. It can happen from abuse. It can happen by rape. It can happen through major accidents. It can happen from abandonment. It can happen from any kind of major disruption or dysregulation to your system, to you, to your core. And this is what trauma is. It is fundamental. It's foundational because it shifts you. It shifts your whole identity, your worldview. You cannot process it, and it harms you in ways that you cannot process through. So there is no confusing, or there should be no confusion as to what trauma is. Now let's talk about what a lot of people are getting confused about, which is this little t trauma. This is like, I was left out in 6th grade. That was a trauma for me, a little t trauma. Yes, there are some traumas that don't seem that big to somebody, but are that big and life-changing and unprocessable and identity and worldview shifting for a person, that it is considered trauma. But the rest of what you face isn't trauma. It is challenges. It is adversity. Trauma forces people to shut down parts of themselves, to repress and suppress parts of themselves and relegate parts of themselves into the unconscious, to split off, to fragment aspects of yourself on a very deep level, right? This is where we start to get labeled, wrongly labeled by medical professionals. These are diagnoses that can come in, right? Extreme schizophrenia or bipolar or depression, manic, whatever the term is. These are people who have split so far aspects of themselves and shut down. Basically what they've done is parts of themselves in order to survive and protect themselves. This is what trauma does. It forces people to shut down and to build walls and protect at all costs. Now, challenges, adversity. This is when something is it can be even very, very overwhelming. But the adversity or the challenge can be so hard on you, yet it doesn't shut you down as a human being. It doesn't force you to change your identity at a fundamental level, or your worldview doesn't shift so dramatically because of what is happened or what is happening or what has happened. And in fact, if you have enough resources and enough self-confidence and enough of a good personal identity and worldview, these things become adversities and challenges and something to work through, to overcome. And we are able to talk about it, express about it, think about it, learn about it. You know, we are able to work through, sometimes slowly, right? Sometimes it's a process, but we are able to work through it in a way where we come out the other side intact. Our identity is still strong, right? The way we feel about the world and ourselves at a deep fundamental level hasn't changed. We have been able to process it in a sense and sometimes come out even stronger, even more capable, even more certain of who we are. So no matter how bad the event is, sometimes we have the resources and we feel so strongly enough in our sense of self that it hasn't shattered our world. It has only made it extremely challenging and difficult for us. But we are able to handle the challenge or the adversity through processing, through going through it. And so that's how we know that it's not trauma, because we're actually able to go through it. We're actually able to transform through that experience, to go through it, to come out the other side and either grow as a human being or stay intact, right? For the better. We grow traits that make us fundamentally better. We feel better about ourselves and the world when we come out the other side of adversities and challenges, no matter how difficult they may be, ranging from getting a cancer diagnosis and going through treatment and coming out the other side, you know, getting abandoned by a friend group, but coming through that challenge and able to see yourself and meet new friends on the other side and be proud of who and what you are. These are not earth-shattering or life-shattering things that happen to us because we are able to process through them. So that's the difference. Can we process through it? Can we process through it and stay intact or mostly intact? This is what I would call a challenge or adversity, and is simply not a trauma. It is simply not a small t trauma. And I think that's where we are getting confused, because trauma is very specific. And the reason why people suffer with trauma is because they've never been able to process it. They've never been able to come through it, right? They've shifted and shut down in ways that they have been unable to process. doesn't mean it's unprocessable forever, but they don't have the coping skills or the strategies or the resources to cope through it. So that's why trauma can be different for different people, particularly if someone has been abused or come into this world without many resources. It makes more things more traumatic for them. They have less resourcing, they have less a good self-identity or a beautiful worldview that they've already built. So when you're experiencing these things from young on, from childhood on, it really does become that you've never learned the resources, you've never had them, and everything falls into this traumatic experience bucket. But yet they are still just challenges and adversities, most of them, and there was an original onset, or there's an original wound. There is the original trauma. And that's what we really want to work with when we're working with trauma, is the original traumatic event or experience that led us to where we are, because that's what needs to be resolved in order to come through and build a new identity and build a new worldview and build up more resources to be able to handle challenges and adversities so that they don't become traumas themselves. There are many people who are traumatized at such a young age that they don't even know that they've been traumatized. It has changed their personal identity and their worldview to such drastic change at a young age that they have shut down parts of themselves and suppressed down parts of themselves forever. This is why some of children who have been traumatized completely grow up to carry out those traumas on other people, act abusively towards their children, thinking that the trauma made them a better person, when actually trauma never changes your personal identity for the better. It never changes your worldview for the better. That's how you know if you have been dealing with trauma, right? It isn't like an adversity or a challenge definitely can change your identity or your worldview for the better. So when you've processed trauma, that's why somebody who's gone through something that is totally traumatic, but they've done a lot of work to process through that trauma, heal that trauma, feel that trauma, they're actually able to look back and have growth out of that trauma. Trauma changes people for the worse. Nobody wants trauma, but given trauma, if you're able to rise out of it and grow your personal identity, grow your worldview for the better, then you've overcome that trauma. You've gained strength, you've gained character, you've gained new positive perspective and personality traits and growth. So this is how some people can look back at a traumatic event and be thankful that it happened, because it changed them into the person that they never ever could have been if they didn't go down that personal healing and transformational and growth journey. Not that they would have ever asked to have that trauma happen to them, but they were able to make something good come out of it after they were able to heal, after they were able to process and come through it. So it's always about transforming and coming through. That's how we heal trauma. A lot of times people come up against challenges and adversities in their life, all through their life, which are not traumatic, but they feel traumatized. And this is because there's an original wound. There's an original trauma that they haven't processed, that they haven't been able to come through, that they haven't been able to grow from. And so they think that they're coming up against trauma after trauma after trauma, but it's really, they're coming up against adversities and challenges, but they're revisiting and they're replaying that old trauma. That's really what's being triggered in them every time they hit a challenge or a major challenge or a major adversity in life. These things are going to happen, but it feels like a trauma to somebody who has a previous trauma wound, a real deep, unprocessed and unprocessable trauma that has changed them at a fundamental level and taken something from them, stolen something from their personal identity or their worldview. And traumas are usually always about a boundary being crossed in a shocking way that you never thought could be crossed. Something has happened personally to you or in the world that has affected you so deeply where you no longer feel the same way. You no longer feel safe, secure, loved, lovable, accepted, all the things that you previously were. So it shakes you to the core. It shakes those personal and world views and identities that you have. And you change in order to adapt so that you stay safe, so that you're lovable, so that you can, survive. And we shift into more of a survival personality. We start to grow survival worldviews, and it's based around survival and preservation and protection. Because we haven't grown through it, we haven't worked through it, right? We weren't able to go through so that we could heal. And instead we started to build around it. We found ways to adapt around it. But that wound, the trauma, is still there, and it needs to be processed, right? It needs to be felt. It needs to be worked through, because we have to go through it and come out the other side in order to grow and heal and become more of who we are, more of who we were meant to be, to see the world better, right? Safer, to grow into a person and to grow into a world where you feel better, more whole, more complete. That can never happen when trauma is sitting there. That's unprocessed. We have to go through it. And it takes work to grow through these things, to overcome these things, to feel through them, to learn through them, to love yourself through them, right? To realize who and what you are through them, and to be able to come up to who you truly are, who you always were, which is totally safe, totally lovable, totally and completely, authentically and beautifully you. Just because you're you. And when you can feel that way about yourself, and when you can feel that your place in the world is valued and safe and free, then we have healed through the trauma. And when people heal their traumas and then they come up against challenges and adversities that don't trigger that previous trauma anymore, that's when we know we've healed the trauma, because now we're dealing with them as serious challenges and adversities and hardships that come up in life. But they don't change who we are. They don't change our identity about ourselves, our beliefs, our values, our worldview. We are able to navigate through them with resources that we have, with the beliefs that we have, right? With the personal identity and the worldview, with this construct that is all an illusion anyway, but we're able to use it to grow us closer to love, closer to freedom, closer to who we are, rather than shut us down. So it expands rather than contracts us. It opens rather than shuts us down. And that is the difference. When we have growth, right, we're expanding. And when we have trauma, we're shut down. We're closed off. We're unable to process. And so if you've ever been confused about what trauma is or isn't, these are my personal thoughts. This is definitely not what mainstream teaches, and it's not even what's out there often in the personal, spiritual, and health coach community. However, this is what I truly believe is trauma, is the root of trauma, and this is why we always need to heal the trauma that have happened to us so that we can face challenges and adversities and hardships and grow into who we were meant to be and feel whole inside, feel complete, feel loved. feel valued, feel secure, feel safe. When we can do this, we overcome trauma. And so I hope that this video has been helpful. I hope it's been insightful. I hope it has shown you why it is so important to understand what trauma is and isn't, and then subsequently how it is that we heal and how we know that we've healed. So it's very important, and it's all broken down in this video. So again, if you're still unclear, watch it again. Really listen, take this in, and you will see in this video what it is, right? Why it's important to heal it, and how we heal it, and then how we know when we've healed it. It is all here in this video. It is not easy, but that's why a lot of my program and a lot of my work focuses on healing trauma, because it's so important to who we are, to who we believe we are inside. So if you enjoyed this video, learned something, found it insightful, give it a like, consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.